So my name is Deepika Chowdhury, D for short. Some of your names I think I've recognized, so you may recognize me from previous Will or WAND conferences where previously I was at Rethink Media, and now I am a director of communications at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. So I've been doing media training and kind of working in the national security space, and particularly working to get women experts on media and more comfortable with media for several years now. So what we're going to do today is we're just going to walk through the mechanics of an interview, and there's a lot of information that we could cover, some of which is really interconnected and interrelated. And so what I'm going to ask you to do, as I'm just throwing up this slide, is to think about and to drop in the chat or the Q&A that Sam is going to be monitoring for us, is actually, what questions do you have? And let me get the screen up and rolling. Here we go. Turn off these subtitles, which is really, what do you want to know? I think that everyone's situation is very different. Everyone has different experience levels when it comes to media. So some folks have quite a lot of experience and have dealt with reporters and been on TV and are really comfortable. And other folks, it's really just this giant black box of mystery and kind of confusing and not more than a little intimidating to get into and to wonder sort of how to interact. So I'm going to pause there and see if you all have any questions that you would be able to drop into the chat. And Sam, since I can't see the Q&A right this second with my screen share, if you could just unmute and let me know what questions people have, that would be super helpful.
Yeah, for sure. Anyone feel free to drop them in the Q&A or the chat.
All right, I'll give you guys like a minute. But if you all are running around or you're just a little shy today, that's okay. I'll just barrel on through.
We have one question. How do you get attention for issues from the media?
Okay, great. We're going to touch on that a little bit, but I can definitely focus on that. All right, so attention for issues. Okay, anything else, or I should just keep rolling through?
Let's keep rolling through, and if anyone else chimes in, I'll be sure to let you know.
Perfect. Okay, so here's what we're going to cover today, which is what journalists and reporters are looking for, the interview process itself, and finally following up. So kind of these three larger buckets, but my goal here is to really demystify the process a little and kind of get you into what I call kind of my communications director brain, which is how I think about these things on behalf of the reporters and then a lot of times the experts that I'm working with, and how to sort of bridge the gap between those two things. So, journalists and what they're looking for. So first off, here is how they're doing. And I pulled a lot of this information from the State of Journalism report by Muckrack. And what they do, and it's a really useful tool that I find, it is geared more towards kind of PR, commsy people, but it's a really useful tool to find out how journalists are thinking and what they're feeling. I think that we sometimes can all fall into the trap of thinking of media as a monolith, much like a lot of members of the public think about government as a monolith, which is the furthest thing from the truth. There's a lot of nuance and complexity. So understanding where reporters and journalists are in their headspace and what they're looking for is actually step one and quite helpful. So first off,
before you move forward, I just want to add in two questions that we got in the chat.
Oh, please.
So one asks, is there a good way to deflect for unprepared questions and stay on the topic or our topic of choice? And then we have another one. Is there tough issues around like women's reproductive rights, guns, public, private ed support? So I guess just about, very sensitive issues as well.
And how to do interviews around them, you would think?
Yes.
Discuss them? Okay.
Yeah, and then one more. If your city's media is quite conservative and you are not, how can you interest them in the issue and or not report it with a strong slant?
Yeah, that's definitely one.
And that's it for now.
All right. Great. These are great questions. And I think we'll end up touching on most of these, but that'll help me sort of adjust a little bit. So kind of first things first is this is the Relentless 2020 news cycle in one chart. 2020 was extremely intense for all of us for a variety of reasons. But I think sometimes when you just look at the sheer amount of news and the amount of things that have happened and that were happening, and I mean, I certainly actually kind of forgot about the Australian bushfires. Imagining that you're a reporter having to absorb all of that news, you don't get a break from it, and it's actually your job to report on it, can be quite helpful to understand just the amount of crunch and pressure that people are on. This is just the second half of the year. So just for like a little bit of context, is just remembering that anyone who is in the media and news environment is dealing with this really insane pace. And I think for as long as the pace of media has been tracked, it is getting worse and it is actually increasing. So just, I mean, it's confirming everything that we knew and felt definitely last year. But just thinking about journalists being in that headspace is sort of one thing. But the questions that the people asked was, are you optimistic about the journalism profession? Many are not. So there's quite a lot of angst sort of in the field itself, and there's a definite understanding from people who are in the field that there's a ton of room for improvement, that there needs to be better coverage, that the coverage needs to reflect the realities of this country and its demographics a lot more, which is something I think all of you, particularly as state and local legislators, are a lot more positioned to take advantage of when you're communicating to reporters about the fact that, hey, this is what people on the ground are really thinking about. But not all stories get covered. So to the question of how do we get attention for issues? And especially in today's environment, just thinking about it, everything is important, right? There's so much stuff that matters a lot, particularly and including our issues. So how do we break through or increase the chances that the stories that we want to have covered are actually going to get covered? And there's a little bit more information in what journalists are talking about and looking at that's helpful here, which is actually why journalists reject otherwise relevant pitches. So a pitch, of course, is an incoming request for, hey, we think you should write this story. And looking at the percentages, a lot of it actually has to do with there's bad timing, there's personalization, lack of personalization, but one interesting nugget here is people who noted things like irrelevant, random, and not localized. So being local in particular is actually quite helpful. So when you all are able to take these kind of big national and national security issues and really bring it down to a more granular level about how it's affecting the citizens in your community and your constituents, that actually makes for quite a powerful story. The next thing is that's exactly what makes a story more shareable. So of course there's a subject connected to a big trending story. So I apologize, there's squeaking in the background because my dog has a squeak toy in his mouth. But a subject connected to a trending story, an image, but also something that is a localized media story that's made relevant to the audience of that journalist. So just thinking about, okay, how can I connect this back to the audience? And an exclusive. So if a reporter, so if you're contacting them saying you need to write this particular story about what's happening here locally in Kansas, what's happening here locally in Georgia at the local level, and you offered an exclusive, perhaps an exclusive interview with you, or maybe if there are constituents or individuals or groups that you're working with or leadership that you're working with, and you're actually able to, in a proactive way, if you're the one reaching out, offer an exclusive to say, hey, we'll give you access. Reporters are much more likely to cover a story. So what that kind of tells us, which is something that we kind of in comms world understand and know, is that a story to have the best and highest likelihood of getting written and published should be relevant, timely, and exclusive. So when you're asking what's a good way to get attention for these issues, these are the 3 filters that you have to run the story through when you are talking about it, when you're trying to convince someone to cover it, and when you're explaining to them why it's really that important. Explain to them why it's relevant, explain to them why it's timely, and if there's any element of exclusivity that you can offer, all the better. So I'm going to pause there and see if we've got any other questions popping up, Sam, before I keep going.
I think you're good to keep going for now.
Perfect. So now that we kind of have covered just generally how reporters are thinking, the next piece is the interview. So one thing that I find can often get confusing or conflated is actually the terminology. So what do I mean by that? And the terminology, this is a lot more specific to print reporters. So a reporter is emailing you for a quote, or they are ones kind of writing in your local paper. It's a little bit different when we are talking TV and radio, because those are live interviews, those are recorded. It's just a lot different. But this general terminology will tend to serve you really well for most of the kind of interviews that a lot of us are dealing with. So the first is on the record. And on the record is pretty clear and straightforward. It is a direct quote said by someone, first and last name and their title. So if you are the one saying, okay, this is an on the record quote, or we're talking on the record, everything that you say will be exactly attributable to you by name and by title. So that's what on the record is. But here's where it can get a little confusing. The second is not for attribution. And there's sometimes just a little bit of oddity with this, but ultimately what not for attribution is a direct quote, but without your name or affiliation. So a good way to think about it not for attribution is a direct quote where someone says some like really spicy, maybe gut twisting quote, and it says, said White House official, said senior leadership official, said XYZ person. So it's one of those quotes where someone could possibly figure out who it was that said this. And a lot of times people will use a not for attribution quote actually as a political maneuvering tool. So it is something to kind of create pressure, but there's a veneer of cover there while you're understanding that someone, if they really know you or they know who they're talking about or who must have been able to say XYZ thing, maybe could figure out who it is. So that's what a not for attribution quote is. Third is on background. So the best way to think about this is that you are providing contextual information that a reporter can paraphrase in their reporting. So one of the ways that one of our experts will do this. So Daryl Kimball at the Arms Control Association, he's the executive director there. One of the things that he will do is because he is an expert in nuclear weapons treaties, he's super steeped in it and has been for decades. So particularly when he's talking to a reporter who is not really steeped on the background, is newer perhaps to this phase, or just has a lot of questions about, okay, what is this? What does this mean? I've never really worked on this before, or hey, can you explain some of the nuances to me? What he will actually do is say, okay, I will provide you a bunch of context on background, allow the reporter to kind of absorb the information, then write up the story of here's what this treaty means, here's what this meeting with, Putin means, and then provide an on the record quote. So he provides the cool context, but then his direct quote isn't just some background information. It's a really powerful, and this is what we should do about it. Here's why it's important. Here's what this means. And he's able to kind of control that narrative really well. So that's what on background means. And finally, there is off the record. So off the record is that the reporter cannot use the information. They can't cite it. They can't allude to it unless it's confirmed by some other legitimate source. So basically, if you as a person, or if I say to a reporter, hey, off the record, this is what's happening, here's what's going on, they have that information in their head, and presumably they believe that I am a trustworthy source, but they cannot use that information unless they can go and verify it with someone else. So the reason for that is also I'm just trying to tell this reporter some information, and I want them to dig in a really particular direction or I want them to ask the right questions, but it cannot come back to me. I shouldn't be affiliated with it in any way, shape, or form. And that's just kind of it. So that's what those 4 terms mean, because again, I think they can get conflated and be a little bit confusing. And they're important when you're actually talking to a reporter, when you are trying to understand some of the differences and nuances, particularly if it's in a little bit of a potentially more hostile environment, or maybe not the friendliest environment, and you want to be really cautious of what you're saying, how you're saying it, you know, and how you're going to get attributed to something. So next, all right, so you've made contact, but I actually have another quick question for you all. And Sam, maybe we're not able to do this quite in the same way, but normally what I would ask is whether, I'm just gonna go back here. That GIF was being kind of silly, but whether there is more kind of outgoing, outgoing pitching, by that I mean, do a lot of you find that you're trying to contact reporters yourself, or you're interested in contacting reporters, or are you getting more incoming requests from reporters, or is it a bit of a mix? Sam, I don't know if you'll know the answer to this question, and I can just ignore it and continue.
I'll keep an eye on the chat if anyone wants to give their input.
Okay, so there is a bit of a difference, not a ton, if you're more outgoing and if you're more incoming when it comes to—
We have some answers. Sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all.
One person said mixed, but not the issues I really want to push. Another legislator said more incoming rather than outgoing. And that's about it we have so far. So it seems pretty mixed. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, that's totally fine. And these are applicable sort of to— So now let's say you've made contact. Now, whether that is that you have successfully gotten a reporter on the phone to respond to your email, or a reporter has come your way and said, hey, we want to talk to you about this. Here's what you want to do. It's 4 things just right off the bat. You want to get back to them quickly. And that's doesn't even have to be confirming that you're going to take the interview, but just to say, hey, I saw this, I can get back to you in the next hour. Can I get back to you in the next 30 minutes? Sort of that, you know, just the way you do one of those confirmation emails when someone sends you something that's urgent, you can't respond to it, but you just want to let them know that you saw it. Just get back to them really quickly. Yeah, just get back to them quickly first. Next, you want to ask them questions. Even if you're getting back to, if you can do that sort of in that first communication, even if you're not confirming, the best thing in particular to ask, like name an outlet sometimes is obvious when they're, of course, incoming, but you can confirm that. The real biggest question that you want to ask them is what their deadline is and what story they're contacting you about. So be like, hey, I'm not going to be able to fully respond to this right now, but I've got some time in the next couple of hours. You know, are you on deadline, or what's your deadline? And can you tell me a little bit more about what it is you wanted to talk about? So just ask those questions right up front, and most reporters will 100% answer. In the meantime, and quite frankly, even if you have a few minutes, so let's say they emailed you and magically you have all of this time on your hands, and you can get back to them kind of quickly, but you don't actually need all that time, you want to Google them. You want to look them up. Reporters, unless it's someone that you've definitely worked with quite a lot before, they're really well established, you know who they are, but just look them up really quickly, because there are new reporters coming in. Sometimes people are wrapped up in other strange things. Sometimes people have said strange things on Twitter. I think this is particularly true if you're in a city with like less friendly media to your positions on issues. You kind of want to know if maybe they're going to put you in a gotcha position, if perhaps they've said something really extreme on the topic that they're reaching out to you about. You just want to know. It's always worth just taking a couple extra minutes before you pick up on the phone or before you respond to like a second round email to find out what it is that they're talking about and what they've said really recently. And fourth, definitely trust your gut. If something feels off about the reporter that you're talking to, and I'll get into this just a tiny bit, but if something just feels weird, or you feel like they're going to put you in a position that can expose you or make you look like, again, I think just a got you position, you can just turn down the interview. Just be like, hey, I don't think I'll be able to take this interview by your deadline. I don't think that I'm an appropriate person to talk about this. I don't know, or you can just politely refuse and not even really give a reason. And that's totally your prerogative. But if something feels off, just turn it down. So that's kind of your first step. But the next thing you really do want to think about, so let's say, all right, you've gone back and forth now, and now you've agreed to take the interview. So it's on a topic that you do want to talk about. It's with a reporter where you're like, okay, this seems like a legit person. They really seem like they want to do an interview with me. All right, great. So now I have to talk to the reporter. Take a step back, sort of right at that minute, and remember who your audience is. And the key here is that your audience is not the reporter, and it's not the individual member of the media. Your audience is ultimately your constituents, and presumably also the audience of that particular newspaper. So your goal, it's not to make the reporter like you. It is, you want the reporter to like you, hopefully a little bit, be polite. But your goal is not to get the reporter to like you. It's not about the reporter and what the reporter wants to hear. It's what your audience wants to hear. And when you're doing that, the thing to remember is human brains work by connecting to emotion, stories, and common ground. So all of you know this way better, certainly, than I will, but this is your bread and butter as politicians, particularly as local politicians. You have to understand your community and your constituents. You have to know what's going to tug at their heartstrings, what they really care about, what thing everyone is worried about. Is it the pothole on the corner? Is it the issues going on at the school? Is it, just local things with your kids? Is it, some kind of drama going on at the park? Now that's right, that's kind of smaller things. Or are we talking like infrastructure budgets and the roads? But just remembering who your audience is and centering everything towards your constituents and not getting too caught up in like the story and this thing is so huge and I have to talk to this person, I have to talk to this person. No, your audience needs emotion, stories, and common ground. And to that end, what you want to do is you want to write 3 talking points, just 3. It's not to say that you can't write other things, but your main goal is to think about your audience. You've got your topic, you think about your audience, and you're going to write 3 talking points. And these 3 talking points should be super short. The kind of arbitrary number that I use, right, is like 10 words, really, really short and simple. And you want talking points that are really sticky in the brain. So what I mean by that is, again, there's a whole ton of cognitive research that has gone into this, but talking points that are sticky in the brain are things that are simple, they're concrete, they're credible, they're emotional, they're stories, and biggest of all, they are usually metaphors. So metaphors are one of the most powerful communications tools just ever. It's the way that we think. We can conceptualize big numbers and really complex ideas if we put them into metaphors that we understand. So I forget what the maximum number is, but basically the human brain, particularly when we're talking about numbers and things like budgets and dollars and what does that mean in this context or that context, the human brain, we really can't conceptualize numbers bigger than 10,000. It really is that low. So when we're talking about, okay, a billion versus a trillion, humans can't really conceive of the difference in those numbers. When we're talking about 500,000 versus, 500 million, we really can't conceive of what that means. So what you want to do is whatever the issue is that you're talking about, you want to put it in context. So talking about this weapon system, again, if we're talking about at the federal level, hey, X weapon system could pay for a year of healthcare for X number of children, right? This could support this number of SNAP meals. Those are really powerful talking points to utilize. So a really great one, I don't know if it's a good example, but a powerful example is the one used kind of in the run-ups to the Iraq War, which was, we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. And this was the phrase that was used and kind of plastered across media by the Bush administration. And it was the metaphor used to sell the Iraq War to the American public, because it's so visceral and real and people can really get their brains around it and think about it. So that's the talking point. And the talking point, of course, should be connected to facts. You can't just have a talking point that is a talking point. You want to have facts and figures to back it up. But keep those quite simple, keep them direct, and keep them your citations quite clear. Now, these talking points, and the reason that they're so important is that this is what you can use to pivot. So to the question about what's a good way to deflect questions, or when you feel like it's getting off topic, or to the person who said that they're getting incoming questions and really it's not relevant, or it's not the best thing that you want to talk about necessarily, but it's still a little tough to get interviews on the topic you do want to talk about. This is where the art of the pivot comes in. And if you've ever watched an interview with Kellyanne Conway, hopefully you haven't watched one recently, because that could be a lot to absorb. But Kellyanne Conway is the master of the pivot. And it really doesn't matter what on earth the topic is. It could be completely unrelated. She is one of those people who is incredibly skilled at pivoting it back to her main talking points, whatever they might be. So these are really great phrases that you can use to pivot. So let's say we're talking about, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on topics right now. Okay, let's say we're talking about like nutrition labels. And what you really want to talk about is, the Pentagon spending in the defense budget and police militarization of your communities. These are the phrases that you would use to do that pivot. And that's perhaps a more extreme example, but you can say, look, nutrition labels are really important because they provide information to the public so that the public can make informed decisions. Similarly, when we are talking about spending on, weapons programs or police programs, there's not a lot of transparency. And what's important to remember is both of these issues are about allowing the public to make informed decisions and providing them the information that they need to know, which is why we need to talk about XYZ issue. So that's a little bit convoluted, and I did that right off the top of my head, but that you get the general idea is thinking about, you kind of have this phrase of the real question is, what people are really concerned about is where their money is going. Let me put that another way. This is why we need to focus on this, because it's affecting our schools. It is changing whether we can invest in our communities, or whether that money is going up to big corporations who are polluting our river systems, right? Whatever it is that you want to say, that is how you sort of do the art of the pivot, is with these types of phrases. So let me pause there for 1 second, Sam, and see if we've gotten any more questions. Otherwise, I'm just gonna rolling through, but I want to make sure I'm pausing periodically.
Nothing, but I will definitely let you know if anyone drops anything in.
Okay, perfect. So here are your kind of pivot topics. So here is just like a little bit of a verbal script where if you're talking to a reporter, okay, they've reached out to you, you've figured out, you've arranged the time, you're getting on the phone with them. This is of course on phone, or you're meeting them in person when we can meet in person. And this is sort of a verbal script just to remember that it's not weird and awkward, even if it can be. You're like, hi, like it's great to speak to you. Before we get started, I wanted to confirm that this conversation is on the record, off the record, not for attribution, or on background, right? So those kind of 4 terms, and you want to say that very, very clearly. And if the person you're talking to sounds a little confused, or it seems something feels a little odd, you can ask, like correct and be like, okay, and that means what for you? Because I know that that can mean slightly different things to slightly different reporters. You can just confirm that. Just say that right in the beginning. Wait for that response, that verbal confirmation. Be like, and my understanding is that you wanted to discuss the topic coverage area, correct? And that again sets the bounds and the parameters of your interview so that all of a sudden it's not veering off into something funky. Or if in the worst case scenario that something does veer off into a different direction, it really empowers you as the person being interviewed or the person having the conversation with the journalist, be like, hey, this is not what we talked about in the very beginning. I asked for clarification. You told me that we were talking about these two topics. You did not mention this one. I'm not comfortable talking about this. And yeah, I'm not comfortable talking about this. That's it. So just waiting for that response. And it's like, okay, wonderful. How can I help you? And then that allows them to ask their questions. But starting out with this really lays out your groundwork and provides clarity onto what it is you're talking about, why you're discussing it. And ultimately, if you say, okay, this is right. So if, for example, we are in a more contentious interview or it's with someone who doesn't really agree with you, and maybe is trying to get at you or is maybe trying to make you feel super comfortable and relaxed so that you say something. This really does empower you to say, hold on, I know we're having a nice time talking about this, but we are on the record and this isn't what we agreed to talk about. So either we need to pause and stop this interview or we need to shift to this being off the record. What would you like to do? And you can just say that because that's just the rules of engagement there. That being said, particularly if it's someone new who you've never worked with before, you're unfamiliar with them, or they're a news organization that you know kind of might have it out for you, assume that you're on the record. That is just a more, that's like kind of the more paranoid side of me. I have found that most of the time, most, good journalists who are adhering to their journalistic principles are not going to violate these rules because it really can burn a source or a bridge. It's unprofessional of them. That being said, it can happen, and particularly if it's something that's a more extreme issue or is more contentious. So just go with your gut and see what it feels like and how you're feeling. So that was a lot of information, but if you remember nothing else from this entire session here today, where I'm talking, remember nothing else. I want you to remember these three things when you're talking to a reporter. One, it is not a casual conversation ever. I don't care if you're, again, when we're at parties again, I don't care if you're at a cocktail party. I don't even care if this person is like, a friend of yours, unless you've known them for many, many, many years. And even then, it's never a casual conversation if there's a reporter around. It doesn't matter if you think no one's overhearing it, if you're on a train, it's just not a casual conversation. So make sure that you have those boundaries very well established, and at minimum that verbal clarification. If it's over email, you can get that kind of written confirmation back and forth. So that's first thing. Second thing, remember who your audience is, who it is that you're trying to connect to. That can be your constituents. Maybe it's also donors. Maybe it is concerned members of the business community. Maybe you're really trying to help push a piece of legislation through and there's a constituency that you're working with and you want to get their support. Remember your audience, because your audience and the reporter are not the same. And make sure that you're connecting with them and that your messaging is connecting with them. And third, prepare those 3 talking points and include a metaphor. That is what is going to have it. Just have it scribbled down. It can literally be on a sticky pad. Just have those couple of words down, and that will help you maintain your focus, particularly if the conversation starts meandering or going one direction or another. That will be your saving grace, 100%. And I've seen this time and time again, even with incredibly seasoned kind of professionals who go on media all the time. If you don't have your talking points, it's going to be a little bit of a tricky situation. So that's with just the general interview. And I fully acknowledge that we did not talk about TV, but that's why I want to leave plenty of time for questions, because then we can talk about that verbally. But this is, I think, 40 minutes is a pretty tight time to cover a lot of this. So I wanted to keep it pretty lean. Finally, here's your follow-up. Okay, so you've had the conversation, it went great. You discussed whatever it is that you wanted to discuss. So there's sort of two phases to this. The first phase is immediately. So now you're done, you have ended your interview, you're still with them on the phone, or you're going back and forth over email, is my assumption. So you want to ask them questions. Just think of it like the end of it was like a job interview, right? You do want to ask questions back. So are there any other contacts that I can help with? So maybe there are people that you're working with. So there are experts that you're connected to, or there's your local community members that you're connected to. Any other contacts that I can help with if they're looking for more resources. So that's one. Two is when and where do you see the story running? And the where sounds a little bit odd, but the where is important because sometimes it will be in print if your local paper still has a print edition. Sometimes it will be online immediately. Sometimes it will be behind their paywall section or not. Sometimes it could be in their syndicated partnerships. So I was just reading actually a little bit earlier today and the other week that a lot of news organizations, particularly local ones, have partnered with Google News, with the Associated Press, kind of a lot of these networks that are built out to syndicate local reporting. So asking where someone sees the story running is quite important. Same thing also for social media, because if it's going to go on their Twitter or their Facebook or their Instagram or their TikTok or their Reddit, where they have perhaps a lot more followers or a lot more engagement than their print side even does, that's really important for you to know and to keep an eye on and to promote and to boost. And then of course, when. So when do you think it's going to come out? Is this like a next day thing, even if their deadline perhaps was super tight? Or is this going to come out, 3 weeks from now? What does this really look like? And then you can just ask, hey, can you let me know when the story runs? And I think tacking this on is usually quite helpful. It's a little bit of fluff, but it is helpful to say, because I'd like to promote it. So for better or worse, many journalists these days do track the shares and social shares of their stories. And a lot of times, depending on what gets traction and engagement, and that too in what way, can really determine some of their future editorial decisions. So if you have this really amazing money quote, if all of a sudden a bunch of people in your community are talking about the story that you were quoted in, a media organization and a reporter is 100% going to notice that. So you can say, hey, let me know when the story runs because I'd like to promote it. I'd like to send it to my networks. I'm connected to these XYZ people, and I think it would be a really great thing. Like, thank you so much. You get to know when it goes up and goes live. You get a link right in your inbox, and they get more shares. So it's just helpful information. And then finally, this one can feel a little bit odd, but I think it's quite important because reporters, especially these days, are cranking out stories incredibly quickly. Sometimes the editorial control and the amount of editing and just oversight that should occur doesn't occur as often, particularly at smaller newspapers, because they're so crunched for resources and staff time. You can confirm, be like, hey, to confirm, I'd like my title to be this, or I'd like my name to be spelled this, or here's how I like to be addressed. Do you have that, or is it easier if I send it via email? Particularly, right, like for me, my name is Deepika Chowdhury. There is a reason that I go by D professionally a lot of times, because for me, a lot earlier in my career, it was easier not to deal with the misspellings and people not remembering like what on earth my name was, especially when I was doing a lot of phone conversations and talking to people on the phone. So I think just acknowledging and knowing, especially if your name gets misspelled or you get mistitled, just say that up front and it's totally okay. So that's kind of your immediate, like you're still on the phone with them after the interview, like, okay, thanks, we're off the record now. Here's the things that you said. So that's the one. The second level of follow-up is after the story runs. So hoping, right, fingers crossed, there's every chance that, you did the interview, you have this most amazing quote, and for some reason the editor kills the story and your story never runs. It totally sucks and is really, really frustrating, but hopefully that won't happen. And if it does, you can always say, hey, better luck next time, or, here's what we can do in the future. But after the story runs, you 100% every single time need to say thank you. and just common courtesy, thanks, this is great, or thanks, I really enjoyed working with you. Even if it's somebody, and perhaps particularly if it's somebody who is like with a conservative media site and they don't misquote you and they represent you fairly, 100% say thank you. It's just good basic relationship management and relationship building. That being said, mistakes do happen, and sometimes that twisting can also happen. We've all seen it, and I'm sure a lot of you have experienced it. So just saying, hey, this is great, but here's one mistake I noticed. You misspelled my name. Actually, this number is incorrect. You paraphrased this wrong, or here's the wrong organization. You do want to read the story and see if there are any mistakes. So one. Another is, hey, this is great, but here's some additional contextual information in case it's useful. Or, hey, this is great, but here's some additional context that I think you might have missed. And even if, right, so for a second one, where if it's like a real mistake, absolutely, they should just update it. Maybe they could issue a correction. But if it's a third one where it's like, here's some additional information or context, the way that I've seen that done, I feel like additional context rarely makes its way back into a story where they will fully kind of add those pieces unless you can make a real case for it. Sometimes what reporters will do is they'll go to Twitter or they'll go to Facebook and they'll say, hey, here's kind of some additional angles on XYZ thing and include that in there, which can be helpful as well. Another thing, which again, you can say even if the piece doesn't run, which is this is great, here's some other stuff that might be relevant in the future. Be like, thanks so much for writing on this thing. Here's this next committee hearing that's coming up in 3 months, by the way. You should definitely come back around on this date, or I would love to contact you again on this. Here's what could be great. Or here's this other initiative that you might not know was going on in this other state or at the national level, right? Just providing information. So generally just start off polite and complimentary. Don't aggravate anyone unnecessarily. And definitely do not, for your first email, take it straight to their editor on the CC line. The way that I think about that, it's like CCing someone's boss on your first email to them. It immediately escalates the situation and can be just unnecessary. Now, there are definitely times where that's appropriate, but just thinking about it, like you are CCing someone's boss on an email line, how would that make you feel? Does the situation warrant that for the first email conversation or not? And just kind of thinking that through. So that is the general part of the presentation there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop share and see what questions you all have, because I know I just covered a lot. I feel like there's also a lot that I have not covered and that maybe you all have questions on. So let me pause there. And I know I haven't really addressed the tough issues question, but let's see if there's anything else. Sam.
Yeah, we actually have someone raising their hand, Rhonda Burnell. So I'm gonna allow you to talk. So you should get a pop-up about turning on your microphone. Rhonda, that should have just popped up for you.
Hello. I was wondering, I got on late. I didn't get on till like about 5:45. Is there any way to get the beginning part of your presentation?
Sure. I know Sam is recording it, and I think you said it was for Will members, but I'm also happy to send slides, and I'll send a one-pager afterwards.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, and we have, so we'll have the recording available for dues paying Will members, and Dee will be sending out a one-pager for everyone who is on this webinar today. So next question, someone asked in the Q&A, I am in a larger metropolitan area in which our media outlets cover a much larger and more diverse area than my district. And I have a number of very well-informed colleagues in my same caucus who have well-established reputations and content specialties. How do I break in to get attention of the media for my issue and my expertise?
That's a really great question. And that's definitely the hardest part, just of building media relations in general. So I think, and this applies specifically with reporters, but even when it comes to building your just general expert profile, right? You are a state and local legislator, which gives you a profile of your own, and you obviously campaigned and ran and won, but you're trying to build up your profile in a different way. So what you want to do is first start out with what is your niche, right? What is it that you want to become known for? And it can be similar. It can even be the same, perhaps, as your other already established colleagues. But what's important is you thinking about, almost slightly independent of them, what is it that you want your professional reputation to be, right? Do you want to be known as a deal maker? Do you want to be known as the expert on, this really specific topic? Do you want to be known as the expert on this topic plus 5 others? And that can sound like I'm just, and I hope it doesn't sound like I'm just talking at you, but what that does and what that means is that provides you kind of clarity of purpose by really establishing, okay, here are my lanes and here's what I want to work on. Once you have that clarity for yourself about, these are my topics, these are my things, this is what I want to do, even if someone else is already doing them, doesn't actually matter. You want to do these things. That's when you start, particularly if you're not getting incoming requests on these topics, this is when you have to start being that proactive person a little bit more. This is gonna it's just where that beginning hustle comes into play. And that's what you want to do. So the key thing that I think to do, and it depends on your comfort level with social media, it just depends on your comfort level, a lot of things, but find and identify let's just say 3 reporters who cover that issue that you want to be known on, even if they cover a whole host of other issues. Who are those kind of 3 folks locally that are covering that issue? And get to know them in some way, shape, or form, right? Whether this you start pitching them like once every couple weeks, like whatever level you can do of engagement to start building a relationship. Every time something happens on your issue, your name should pop up in their inbox saying, hey, here's what I think on this, or hey, I have expertise on this, here's what I would like to talk about. Just build up that name recognition with them. And I think that that's a really good first step. And I just saw, I think Wanda also popped in, maybe that was Corey, writing an op-ed on that topic as well is a really good way for all of a sudden it's like, oh, this is the person who actually knows a lot on this particular topic. So you kind of have to be more proactive than reactive, unfortunately, because you're not as established, perhaps. Hopefully that made sense.
Great. And I want to go back to one of the earlier questions about what to do if your city's media is quite conservative and you're not. Is there any ways to get them interested in an issue without the strong slant?
That is definitely a tricky one. And again, you're going to know your local media environment a little bit better, obviously, than I will. I think the key point is that even if there is a slant to their reporting, one, just being self-aware of what their slant is and the direction they take it in. 2, again, identifying those individual reporters or those stories where you're like, all right, this is still slanted, but this seems to get most of the facts correct. Who is the person who wrote this? Or who is the person who was responsible for this story? Start noticing the names of the people behind the stories that, to be frank, you can kind of stand, that you're like, all right, it's slanted, but it's not that bad. Or it's slanted, but at least that they're direct quoting me. And the way to manage that relationship is to just be really clear about when you're on the record, be particularly cautious, but also present it to them as like, hey, I know that you're trying to report on these things for the community, right? So journalists, particularly good journalists who take their mission seriously, it is ultimately supposed to be in the service of the public and the public good. And sometimes you can just appeal to that sense of you're trying to serve the public. I know that you are working with these other individuals. My voice is the counterbalance to that, and your reporting should be balanced. You should have multiple viewpoints in your reporting Mine is the other point of view, and you can disagree with it, or, you know, a lot of your readers might disagree with it, but here's why I think what I think. And I think it's important for you to include my voice. And I think that that's a perfectly legitimate way to just say that and establish that, to say, look, I get it, but also here's what I'm thinking, while still being cautious and cognizant of the fact that, like, you want to be real careful about when you're on the record and off the record so that your words don't get misconstrued. So keeping your sentences when you are talking to them, perhaps keeping it in written form, in email, so you have a record. Perhaps keeping your sentences, if you're talking to them on the phone, quite short and very tight. Maybe if you want triple backup, you know, have another phone and be recording your phone call conversation, depending on the laws in your state and, you know, if you get their consent and everything else, right? It's different for everyone. But if that's something that you're a little bit worried about, you can do that too. Then at least you have some legs to stand on if something comes out and you're like, this is not what I said, this is misconstrued, here's what I said, here's the proof. So just, I think, thinking about it that way. All right, I know we're coming close to our times.
Yeah, if there's any last questions anyone has, we have time for about one more. I just want to repeat that we are recording this, and the webinar recording will be available to dues paying members of the WILL program. And Dee was thoughtful enough to create a one-pager based off this presentation that I will be sharing with everyone who attended. So yeah, get any last minute questions. Also, Dee, if you have any closing thoughts, you've done presentations for women state legislators before, so you definitely know their concerns and things that come up for them.
Yeah, I think if anything in a closing thought is, you all are just kind of, to a person and any kind of WILL program that I've ever met, and kind of all of the legislators that I've ever met, you all know your constituents and communities. You all know the things that matter to them, and you understand them deeply. And when it comes to any communications at all, whether it is interviews, whether it's op-eds, whether it's should you be on Twitter, should you not, you want to center the needs of your constituents and center your messaging around what is going to resonate with them, while also being self-aware of who you are and what you bring to the table, and make sure you're getting your own kind of professional needs fulfilled. And that means that balancing act of, here's how I want to grow, here's where I want my career to go, here's what I want to be known for. And all of those, you can do all of those things while still serving your constituents. And I think it's just sometimes that balancing act. And it can be tough because we can sometimes tip too much one direction or the other. It happens to all of us, but you all know what you're doing. And I just say, like, trust your gut. If something feels weird or feels wrong, don't push yourself into it. Don't be like, no, I have to take this interview just because it's the New York Times. No, you don't. You don't need to do anything you don't want to. You don't need to do anything that feels off. And I think just remembering that generally.
Got it. Well, thank you so much, Dee, for that presentation and that great closing thoughts. Definitely something to always keep in mind. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I know it's a Tuesday after or evening, and really appreciate you joining us today, and be on a lookout for our May webinar schedule that should be coming out soon. So thanks again, Dee, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their night.
Thanks so much. It was great. Talk to you all later. Bye.